The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness over the Hindu Kush Mountains. Overlord, this is Reaper 6. We have eyes on the compound. Confirming 12 tangos, possible HVT in the southeast building. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Commander Marcus Tank Rodriguez, leading a SEAL team that had been tracking high-value targets across the Afghanistan-Pakistan border for 3 weeks. What happened next would become legend in every forward operating base from Kandahar to Kuwait, whispered in mess halls and briefing rooms with the kind of reverence usually reserved for Medal of Honor recipients. But at that moment, crouched in the shadows of a bombed-out village, Rodriguez had no idea he was about to witness something that would redefine everything he thought he knew about air support. The mission had gone sideways faster than a grenade rolling down a mountain slope. Intelligence reports had been wrong again. Instead of a routine extraction of a mid-level Taliban commander, the SEALs found themselves surrounded by an entire network of fortified positions, with reinforcements streaming in from 3 directions. The compound wasn't just a hideout. It was a fortress, bristling with heavy machine guns, RPGs, and enough ammunition to level half of Helmand Province. Overlord Reaper 6. We are taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Request immediate close air support, danger close, grid reference. Rodriguez's transmission cut to static as an explosion rocked the hillside 50 meters from their position. Dust and debris rained down on the 8-man team, already down to 7 after Petty Officer Jenkins took shrapnel in his shoulder during the initial approach. The operations center at Bagram Airfield erupted into controlled chaos. Duty officers scrambled to coordinate assets, pulling up satellite feeds and weapon systems availability. Every available aircraft was already committed to operations across the theater. The closest Apache was 40 minutes out. The nearest A-10 Warthog was refueling in Qatar. Time was a luxury the SEALs didn't have. Then a voice cut through the radio chatter, calm, professional, with just a hint of an accent that suggested somewhere in the American Southwest. Overlord, this is Viper 27. I'm 10 minutes out with a full loadout, ready to provide immediate support. There was a pause. In the operations center, Major General Patricia Hayes frowned at her tactical display. Viper 27 wasn't on the board, wasn't supposed to exist, according to the evening's flight schedule. She grabbed the radio handset herself, her weathered face creased with concern and confusion. Viper 27, Overlord Actual, confirm your position and mission status. You are not showing on our scope. The response came back steady, unhurried, as if the pilot was discussing weekend plans rather than preparing to dive into a firefight where American lives hung in the balance. Overlord Actual, Viper 27, currently inbound from the northwest, Angels 22, carrying mixed ordnance. I have good copy on Reaper 6's situation. In the mountains below, Rodriguez pressed himself against a boulder as another burst of machine gun fire chewed up the rocks above his head. Through his night vision scope, he could see muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like a deadly constellation. His men were pinned down in a kill zone with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The Taliban fighters had them bracketed perfectly, using the high ground and prepared positions to devastating effect. Any station, this is Reaper 6, Rodriguez called out, desperation creeping into his voice despite years of training. We are combat ineffective and taking casualties. Need immediate extract or close air support. We cannot hold this position much longer. The sound that answered him wasn't another radio transmission. It was something else entirely, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the heavens themselves, growing louder with each passing second. Rodriguez looked up through his night vision, scanning the star-filled sky for the source of the noise. What he saw made him forget, for just a moment, that he was in the middle of a firefight. An F-16 Fighting Falcon was descending through the darkness at an angle so steep it defied everything he knew about tactical aviation. The aircraft was moving fast, too fast for a normal attack run, and as it dropped lower, Rodriguez could see something that made his blood run cold. Sparks were streaming from both wingtips, bright orange cascades trailing behind the jet like the tail of a comet. No pilot in their right mind would fly like that. No pilot would risk their aircraft, their life, and their career for a routine close air support mission. But as Rodriguez watched, transfixed, the F-16 continued its impossible dive toward the Taliban positions, those sparks growing brighter and more intense with each passing second. The radio crackled again, and this time there was something different in the pilot's voice. Something that made every man on that mountainside, American and Taliban alike, stop what they were doing and look up at the sky. Reaper 6, Viper 27, I have visual on your position. Recommend you keep your heads down for the next 30 seconds. Major Catalina, Cat, Vasquez had been flying combat missions for 8 years, but she had never pushed an F-16 like this. The warning lights on her instrument panel were painting the cockpit red, and her heads-up display was flashing alerts faster than she could acknowledge them. The sparks trailing from her wingtips weren't just for show. They were evidence of a desperate gamble that could kill her just as easily as save the men trapped on the ground below. 3 hours earlier, she had been sitting in the pilot's lounge at a classified forward operating base, nursing a cup of coffee that tasted like motor oil and listening to the other aviators trade war stories. As usual, the conversation had turned to the mysterious pilot known only as Cat, a female F-16 driver who had supposedly pulled off impossible missions across the theater, appearing out of nowhere to save ground troops before vanishing again like a ghost. "I'm telling you she doesn't exist," Captain Bulldog Martinez had insisted, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of someone who had never been wrong about anything. "It's just stories, propaganda to boost morale. No way a single pilot is running solo missions without clearance, without backup, without leaving a paper trail." Lieutenant Colonel Hawk Davidson nodded in agreement, his scarred hands wrapped around a mug that had seen better decades. "I've been flying in this theater for 2 years. Never seen hide nor hair of this mysterious cat person. Just another urban legend, like the Phantom F-4 over Hanoi or the ghost of the Red Baron." What they didn't know was that Cat was sitting 20 feet away, hidden behind a maintenance manual and listening to every word. She had learned long ago to stay invisible when she wasn't in the cockpit. It was easier that way. Fewer questions, fewer complications, fewer people trying to ground her or transfer her to a desk job back in the States. But invisibility had a price. Every mission she flew, every life she saved, every impossible victory she pulled from the jaws of defeat, none of it existed in the official record. She was a ghost pilot flying ghost missions, accumulating ghost victories that would never be acknowledged or celebrated. The men and women she saved went home to their families, but Cat remained in the shadows, always moving, always alone. Tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight was supposed to be her last mission in the theater. Tomorrow morning, she was scheduled to fly a transport back to Ramstein Air Base in Germany, then on to MacDill in Florida for reassignment to a training squadron. After 8 years of combat, someone in the Pentagon had decided that Major Catalina Vasquez had done her duty and earned the right to teach young pilots how to fly straight and level instead of dodging surface-to-air missiles. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was being transferred because she was too valuable to lose, too experienced to risk. But experience and value meant nothing to the SEALs trapped in the Hindu Kush, and all the flight safety regulations in the world wouldn't bring them home alive. So when the emergency call came through, Kat had made a choice that would define the rest of her career, the rest of her life, and quite possibly the rest of aviation history. She had ignored her orders, ignored protocol, ignored common sense, and taken off into the night with a full combat load and a heart full of determination. Now, diving toward the Taliban positions at a speed that made her F-16 scream in protest, Kat felt the familiar calm that always settled over her in moments like this. Time seemed to slow down, her breathing became steady and controlled, and the chaos of combat resolved itself into a series of clear, simple decisions. The sparks streaming from her wingtips weren't accidental. They were the result of a modification she had made to her aircraft months earlier, titanium strips attached to retractable mounts that could be deployed in flight. When extended at high speed, the strips created a spectacular pyrotechnic display that was visible for miles. It was psychological warfare at its most basic level, designed to confuse and intimidate enemy forces while providing a clear visual reference for friendly ground troops. More importantly, the sparks served as a warning. Anyone who saw an F-16 diving out of the night sky with fire trailing from its wings knew that something unprecedented was about to happen, something that would be talked about for years to come. Rodriguez watched through his night vision as the F-16 leveled out barely 200 feet above the Taliban positions. The sound of the jet's engine was deafening now, a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very mountains. But it was what happened next that made him understand why some pilots become legends and others simply become statistics. Instead of launching missiles or dropping bombs from a safe distance, Kat brought her F-16 in low and slow, using the aircraft itself as a weapon. The jet wash from her engines created a hurricane of dust and debris that turned the Taliban positions into a whirlwind of confusion. Machine gun nests that had been pouring deadly accurate fire into the SEAL positions suddenly found themselves blind and disoriented, their carefully planned fields of fire disrupted by a wall of swirling sand and stone. But Kat wasn't finished. As she pulled up from her first pass, she armed her 20 cannon and prepared for something that hadn't been attempted since the early days of the Vietnam War. A gun run so low and so precise that she would be firing between friendly and enemy positions, with a margin of error measured in meters rather than kilometers. The radio crackled with transmissions from multiple stations as air traffic controllers, mission commanders, and fellow pilots realized what was happening. Viper 27, this is Overlord. Negative on gun runs, repeat, negative on gun runs. Friendlies are too close, abort your attack. Kat's response was calm, professional, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. Overlord, Viper 27, I have good visual on friendly positions. Commencing gun run. What happened next would be studied in military academies for decades to come, analyzed and dissected by tacticians trying to understand how one pilot in one aircraft could change the course of a battle in 30 seconds of flying that defied every rule in the book. Kat brought her F-16 around in a turn so tight that the G-forces should have knocked her unconscious. The aircraft groaned and shuddered under the stress, but held together as she lined up for her attack run. Through her heads-up display, she could see the Taliban positions laid out below her like a deadly maze, with the SEAL team's location marked by infrared strobes visible only to her night vision system. The margin for error was essentially zero. Too far to the left and her 20 rounds would tear through Rodriguez and his men. Too far to the right, and the Taliban fighters would have time to reposition and counterattack. Too high, and her shots would be ineffective. Too low, and she would fly directly into the path of her own bullets. But Kat had spent 8 years preparing for this moment. 8 years flying missions that other pilots considered impossible. 8 years building a reputation that existed only in whispered stories and classified after-action reports. As she squeezed the trigger and felt her F-16 shudder with the recoil of the 6-barreled Vulcan cannon, she knew that this was what she had been born to do. The 20 rounds struck the Taliban positions with surgical precision, each burst carefully placed to neutralize threats without endangering the Americans trapped below. Machine gun nests that had been pouring fire into the SEAL positions fell silent as armor-piercing rounds found their targets. RPG teams that had been preparing to launch rockets at Rodriguez's men were scattered by explosions that lit up the mountainside like the 4th of July. In less than 10 seconds, Kat had fired over 200 rounds and completely changed the tactical situation on the ground. The Taliban fighters who had been confidently pressing their attack suddenly found themselves under assault from an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't predict, and couldn't counter. Some fled into the deeper caves and tunnels that honeycombed the Afghan mountains. Others held their positions but stopped firing, unwilling to reveal their locations to the ghost pilot who seemed to be able to strike anywhere at will. Rodriguez keyed his radio, his voice filled with awe and disbelief. "Viper 27, Reaper 6. That was some of the finest flying I've ever seen. How copy?" Kat's response came back immediately, but now there was something different in her voice. The professional calm was still there, but underneath it was something that sounded almost like satisfaction. "Reaper 6, Viper 27, copy all. Be advised I'm not finished yet." As she spoke, Kat was already setting up for her next pass, this one designed to clear a landing zone for the helicopter extraction that would get Rodriguez and his men out of the kill zone. But as she scanned the terrain through her targeting system, she realized that the situation was more complicated than she had initially thought. The Taliban forces weren't just defending prepared positions. They were part of a larger operation designed to trap and eliminate the SEAL team. Through her infrared sensors, Kat could see additional enemy forces moving through the valleys below, converging on Rodriguez's position from multiple directions. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, armed with heavy weapons, and moving with the kind of coordination that suggested military training rather than guerrilla tactics. This wasn't just a firefight. It was an ambush that had been planned for weeks, maybe months. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The intelligence that had sent Rodriguez and his men into this valley hadn't been wrong. It had been compromised. Someone had leaked the mission details to the Taliban, turning what should have been a routine operation into a death trap. The SEALs weren't just pinned down. They were the bait in a larger operation designed to lure American forces into a prepared killing ground. Kat's mind raced through the tactical implications as she climbed back to altitude, her F-16's engine straining against the thin mountain air. The helicopter extraction that Rodriguez was counting on would fly directly into a gauntlet of surface-to-air missiles and heavy machine guns. Even if it made it to the landing zone, it would be shot down before it could get the SEALs out. There was only one solution, and it was insane even by Kat's standards. She would have to clear not just the immediate area around the SEAL team, but the entire valley, miles of rugged terrain defended by hundreds of enemy fighters with weapons specifically designed to shoot down aircraft like hers. She keyed her radio, knowing that what she was about to say would probably end her career and might very well end her life. "Overlord, Viper 27. Request permission to engage all enemy forces in Grid Square 77 Alpha. I'm going to clear the valley." The response from Bagram was immediate and predictable. "Viper 27, Overlord actual. Negative, repeat negative. You are not authorized for independent operations. RTB immediately." Kat looked down at the mountains below, where 7 of America's finest warriors were trapped in a kill zone that would claim their lives unless someone did something unprecedented, something that had never been attempted before in the history of military aviation. She thought about the pilots back at the lounge, arguing about whether she even existed. She thought about the assignment waiting for her in Florida, teaching young aviators to play it safe and follow the rules. She thought about the hundreds of enemy fighters converging on Rodriguez's position, and the families back home who would never see their loved ones again if she followed orders and flew back to base. The choice, when it came, was easier than she had expected. "Overlord Viper 27, unable to comply. I have American lives to save." With that transmission, Major Catalina "Cat" Vasquez officially went rogue, becoming the first pilot in modern military history to openly defy direct orders in order to conduct an unauthorized combat mission. What happened next would be remembered as either the greatest act of heroism in the history of military aviation, or the most spectacular court-martial in the history of the United States Air Force. Probably both. Kat rolled her F-16 into a dive that would have been impossible for any other pilot in any other aircraft, pushing her machine beyond its design limits as she prepared to take on an entire army with nothing but skill, determination, and a finite supply of ammunition. The sparks from her wingtips blazed brighter than ever as she plummeted toward the valley floor, and for just a moment, every fighter, American and Taliban alike, stopped what they were doing to watch a single F-16 attempt something that existed only in the realm of legend and myth. The impossible was about to become inevitable, and the ghost pilot was about to become very, very real. As Kat's F-16 screamed down toward the valley at an angle that made experienced pilots wince, Rodriguez pressed himself deeper into the rocks and tried to process what he was witnessing. In 12 years of special operations, he had called in air support from every type of aircraft in the American arsenal. He had worked with A-10 pilots who could put 30 rounds through a window from 2 miles away, Apache crews who could hover in the middle of a firefight and methodically eliminate targets with surgical precision, and B-1 bomber pilots who could turn entire grid squares into parking lots. But he had never seen anything like this. The F-16 was moving too fast for a normal gun run, too low for missile employment, and too aggressively for any pilot who valued their career or their life. As it leveled out barely 50 feet above the Taliban positions, the jet wash from its engine created a dust storm that obscured the entire battlefield. Machine gun tracers that had been chasing the aircraft suddenly went wild, firing blindly into the swirling cloud of debris. Then the cannon started firing. The sound was indescribable, a mechanical thunderstorm that seemed to tear the very air apart. The muzzle flash from the 20 Vulcan cannon strobed like lightning, and the impact of each round on the rocky terrain below created explosions that Rodriguez could feel in his chest. But what impressed him most wasn't the violence of the attack, it was the precision. Kat was firing in short, controlled bursts, each one lasting no more than a second or two. She was picking off individual targets with the kind of accuracy that should have been impossible at her speed and altitude. A machine gun nest that had been raking the SEAL positions fell silent as 20 rounds found their target. An RPG team preparing to fire at the trapped Americans was scattered by an explosion that struck precisely between their position and Rodriguez's men. Through his night vision scope, Rodriguez could see Taliban fighters diving for cover, abandoning their weapons, and running for the deeper caves that offered protection from aerial attack. In less than 30 seconds, Kat had transformed a coordinated enemy assault into a panicked rout. But as her F-16 climbed away from the valley floor, trailing those mysterious sparks from its wingtips, Rodriguez realized that the respite was temporary. His radio was crackling with reports from the other SEAL teams positioned on the surrounding ridges, and what they were telling him made his blood run cold. Reaper 6, this is Reaper 3. We have multiple vehicles moving up the North Ridge. Count at least 20, maybe more. They're bringing up heavy weapons. Reaper 6, Reaper 4. Confirm movement on the south approach. Looks like technical vehicles with mounted guns. They're trying to get above us. Rodriguez keyed his radio, his mind racing through tactical options that were rapidly dwindling to zero. Reaper elements, Reaper 6. Consolidate on my position. We're going to have company from all directions. As he spoke, he was watching the F-16 circle high above the valley, and for the first time in his military career, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Rodriguez found himself praying that a pilot he had never met would continue to ignore orders, ignore common sense, and ignore self-preservation in order to save the lives of 7 men she had never seen. In the cockpit of her F-16, Kat was running through calculations that would have challenged a supercomputer. Fuel remaining, ammunition count, threat assessment, weather conditions, escape routes, all of it had to be processed and analyzed while flying at 400 knots through mountainous terrain at night. The Taliban reinforcements were converging on the valley from 3 directions, and each column was heavily armed with weapons specifically designed to bring down aircraft. Her radio crackled with transmissions from Bagram, each one more urgent than the last. Viper 27, this is Overlord Actual. You are ordered to disengage immediately and return to base. Acknowledge. Kat ignored the transmission, focusing instead on the tactical display that showed the approaching enemy forces. She had enough ammunition for perhaps 2 more gun runs, enough fuel for maybe 20 minutes of combat maneuvering, and enough luck to last approximately 30 seconds against the kind of anti-aircraft fire she was about to fly into. The smart play would be to follow orders, return to base, and let the bureaucrats figure out how to extract Rodriguez and his men through official channels. The safe play would be to wait for reinforcements, coordinate with higher command, and conduct the operation by the book. But Kat had stopped playing it safe 8 years ago, on a night very much like this one, when she had watched good men die because air support arrived 5 minutes too late. She had made a promise to herself that night, a promise that she would never let bureaucracy, protocol, or common sense stand between her and the Americans who needed her help. Tonight she intended to keep that promise, even if it killed her. Kat rolled her F-16 into another impossible dive, this one aimed at the northern approach where the first column of Taliban reinforcements was climbing toward the ridge that overlooked Rodriguez's position. Through her targeting system, she could see the convoy spread out along the narrow mountain road. Pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns, technical vehicles carrying rocket launchers, and what looked like a converted bus filled with fighters. As she lined up for her attack run, Kat allowed herself a moment of dark satisfaction. For 8 years, she had been the Air Force's best-kept secret, the pilot who didn't officially exist, the ghost who appeared whenever American lives were on the line. Tonight, she was going to make sure that everyone remembered her name. The 20 cannon spoke again, and another legend was born in the mountains of Afghanistan. The convoy never knew what hit them. One moment they were grinding up the mountain road, confident in their numbers and their mission. The next moment, their world exploded in a storm of 20 depleted uranium rounds that turned armored vehicles into scrap metal and turned the narrow road into an impassable crater field. Kat's first burst caught the lead vehicle square in the engine block, the armor-piercing rounds punching through steel like tissue paper, before detonating the fuel tank in a fireball that illuminated the entire mountainside. Her second burst walked down the convoy, each round placed with surgical precision to maximize damage while minimizing collateral effects. By the time she pulled up from her attack run, half the convoy was burning and the other half was scattered across the rocky terrain, their occupants more concerned with survival than with attacking American forces. But even as she climbed back to altitude, Kat knew that she had only bought Rodriguez a few minutes of breathing room. The other 2 columns were still approaching, and her ammunition was running dangerously low. More critically, her fuel gauge was showing numbers that made her stomach tighten with concern. She had maybe 10 more minutes of combat time before she would be forced to either land somewhere or risk running out of fuel entirely. The radio crackled again, and this time the voice belonged to someone Kat recognized, Brigadier General Patricia Hayes, the theater air commander and one of the few people who knew about Kat's unauthorized missions. Viper 27, this is Overlord Actual. Major Vasquez, I know it's you. Stand down immediately. That's a direct order. Kat's finger hesitated over the radio transmit button. General Hayes had been her mentor, her protector, and quite possibly the only reason she hadn't been court-martialed months ago for her unauthorized activities. The general had covered for her, redirected investigations, and made sure that Kat's ghost missions remained officially invisible. To openly defy her would be tantamount to career suicide. But as Kat looked down at the mountains below, where 7 of America's finest warriors were still trapped in a kill zone, the choice became clear. Some things were more important than careers, more important than rules, more important than the comfortable certainty of following orders. "General," Kat replied, her voice steady and calm despite the chaos swirling around her aircraft, "with all due respect, I have Americans in contact. I'm not leaving them." The silence that followed that transmission seemed to last forever. In operations centers from Bagram to the Pentagon, senior officers stared at their radios in disbelief. In the history of the United States military, very few officers had ever openly defied a direct order from a general officer. Even fewer had done so while conducting combat operations in enemy territory. Rodriguez, pressed against the rocks and listening to the radio chatter, found himself holding his breath. He didn't know who this Viper 27 pilot was, but he was beginning to understand that he was witnessing something unprecedented, something that would be talked about in military circles for decades to come. The general's response, when it finally came, was delivered in a tone that could freeze helium. "Major Vasquez, you are relieved of duty effective immediately. Return to base or I will have you shot down by our own aircraft." Kat's laughter came through the radio clear and unmistakable, a sound that was simultaneously terrifying and oddly comforting to the men trapped below. "General, you'd have to catch me first, and right now, I have work to do." As she spoke, Kat was already lining up for her next attack run, this one aimed at the southern approach where the second column of Taliban reinforcements was climbing toward the ridge. Through her night vision system, she could see that this group was larger and better equipped than the first, with what looked like shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles visible among their equipment. The smart pilot would have stayed high, used standoff weapons, minimized the risk of being shot down. The smart pilot would have waited for backup, called in additional air support, followed proper procedures. But Kat had never been accused of being smart. She had been accused of being reckless, insubordinate, and dangerously unpredictable. Tonight, she was about to prove that sometimes those qualities were exactly what the situation required. She pushed her F-16 into another vertical dive, the sparks from her wingtips blazing like twin comets as she plummeted toward the enemy convoy. The altimeter spun backward so fast it was almost a blur. 8,000 feet, 6,000, 4,000, 2,000. At 500 feet above ground level, traveling at nearly 500 knots, Kat pulled her aircraft out of the dive with a G-force that should have knocked her unconscious. Her vision grayed at the edges, her breathing became labored, and every rivet in her F-16 groaned under the stress. But she held on, held the dive, held the impossible angle of attack until she was exactly where she needed to be. The Taliban fighters in the convoy had perhaps 2 seconds to realize what was happening before 20 rounds began ripping through their vehicles with devastating effect. But this time, they were ready for her. As Kat's cannon fired its deadly stream of projectiles, surface-to-air missiles began launching from multiple positions along the convoy. The missiles were old Soviet-era SA-7s, heat-seeking weapons that locked onto the infrared signature of jet engines. Against a normal attack profile, they would have been marginally effective at best. But Kat was flying so low and so slow that she presented a perfect target for weapons designed to bring down helicopters and close support aircraft. The first missile missed her by mere meters, its proximity fuse detonating close enough to pepper her aircraft with shrapnel that starred her canopy and triggered warning lights throughout her cockpit. The second missile locked onto her exhaust and began tracking with deadly precision, its seeker head following every twist and turn of her evasive maneuvers. Kat had perhaps 3 seconds to live. What happened next would be analyzed by weapons specialists and tactical experts for years to come. But in the moment, it was pure instinct born from 8 years of combat flying and a desperate determination to save the men trapped below. Instead of trying to outrun the missile, impossible at her altitude and airspeed, Kat did something that had never been attempted in the history of military aviation. She used the mountains themselves as a weapon. banking her F-16 into a turn so sharp that it should have torn the wings off her aircraft. Cat flew directly toward a rocky outcropping that jutted from the mountainside like a stone spear. The heat-seeking missile followed, its simple electronic brain focused only on the infrared signature of her engines. At the last possible second, Cat pulled up and over the rocky projection, her landing gear actually scraping against stone as she cleared the obstacle by less than 10 feet. The missile, unable to make the same impossible maneuver, slammed into the mountainside and exploded in a fireball that lit up the entire valley. But Cat's reprieve was temporary. More missiles were already in the air, and her fuel situation was becoming critical. She keyed her radio, her voice still calm despite the fact that she was flying through a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire at an altitude that made crop dusters look high. Reaper 6, Viper 27, I'm going to need you to mark your position with IR strobes. I'm coming in for one final pass, and then we're getting you out of here. Rodriguez didn't hesitate. Within seconds, infrared strobes were flashing from the SEAL team's position, invisible to the naked eye but clearly visible to Cat's night vision systems. What she saw when she looked down made her heart sink. The Taliban forces had used the distraction of her attacks on the convoys to reposition themselves, and Rodriguez's team was now completely surrounded. There was no way a helicopter could get in to extract them. There was no way they could fight their way out on foot, and Cat's F-16 was running on fumes, with barely enough ammunition left for one more gun run. For the first time in her career, Major Catalina Vasquez was faced with a tactical problem that had no solution, a mathematical equation that didn't balance, a mission that could not be accomplished. Unless she was willing to do something that no military pilot had ever done before, something that would either save 7 American lives or kill them all in the attempt. Cat looked down at her fuel gauge, at her ammunition counter, at the tactical display that showed enemy forces closing in from all sides. Then she looked at the photograph taped to her instrument panel, a picture of her brother Miguel, who had died in Iraq when his convoy was ambushed and no air support was available. The choice, when it came, was the easiest she had ever made. Reaper 6, Viper 27. I want you and your men to get as low as possible and cover your heads. What I'm about to do is going to get very loud, very bright, and very dangerous for everyone involved. Rodriguez pressed himself against the rocks, his mind racing through possibilities. Viper 27, what's your plan? Cat's response came back immediately, delivered with the kind of calm certainty that made grown men believe in miracles. I'm going to clear you a landing zone the old-fashioned way. Tell your men to be ready to move when I give the signal. As she spoke, Cat was already setting up for what would be remembered as either the most brilliant tactical maneuver in the history of close air support, or the most spectacular suicide mission ever attempted by a military pilot. She armed every remaining weapon on her aircraft: missiles, bombs, cannon rounds, even the emergency flares designed for signaling rescue aircraft. What she was about to do had never been tried before, had never even been considered possible. But then again, Major Catalina "Cat" Vasquez had built her entire career on doing the impossible. The mountains of Afghanistan were about to witness something that would become legend. In the operations center at Bagram, General Hayes watched her tactical display with a mixture of horror and admiration, as Cat's F-16 began what could only be described as a controlled collision course with the mountainside. Every air traffic controller in the room was shouting warnings, every tactical expert was predicting disaster, and every pilot who understood what they were seeing was holding their breath. She's going to crater herself, someone whispered. She's going to fly directly into the mountain. But Hayes, who had been flying military aircraft since before Cat was born, recognized what she was seeing. It wasn't a suicide run. It was something far more dangerous and far more brilliant. Cat wasn't planning to crash into the mountainside. She was planning to use her F-16 as a precision demolition charge. The technique had been theorized but never attempted, using an aircraft's remaining ordnance and fuel load to create a controlled explosion that would eliminate enemy positions while leaving friendly forces unharmed. It required split-second timing, absolute precision, and a willingness to risk everything on a maneuver that existed only in the realm of theoretical possibility. It also required a pilot with nerves of steel, reflexes that bordered on superhuman, and a complete disregard for personal safety. In other words, it required someone exactly like Major Catalina Vasquez. Kat's F-16 dove toward the Taliban positions one final time, but this approach was different from all the others. Instead of pulling up after her attack run, she continued diving, her aircraft pointed directly at the center of the enemy formation. To anyone watching from the ground, it looked like the pilot had lost control, like the aircraft was about to crash into the mountainside in a fireball that would eliminate everyone, friend and foe alike.